Hey, how do you feel about some high rarity cards, or maybe some foreign ones, or maybe be ahead of the game with others by preparing for future set releases with very quick shipping? Check out EJ Gaming and use code British5 on checkout for 5% off on all your orders. Link in the description.
Greetings those and welcome to another video. In the last video that I made, we talked about a few possible tech cards you should be considering for the next format. Age of Overlord already shifted the meta game, and a lot of things that like were common or uncommon just shifted out in between. And now we're going to be seeing trends that should be picking up as we move along. Now I want to talk about something that did the exact opposite. Uh, I want to talk about a card that not many people are playing anymore, and I've been asked already like once or twice in the past few days, like if this card is still good, if this card should be still considered in the side deck, if this particular card good against certain matchups, and I figured this is a really interesting topic because not many people are thinking about this, and yeah, so we're we're going to use the YCS as a good catalyst for what I'm about to bring up. I feel like watching the top 32 lists from like the recent YCS is a good like basis for like analytics. Other people like Hakuna Maidara do this kind of things as well with YGO scope and like other means, but I just want to use like a relatively like recent sample size just to prove one point that I'm going to bring up with the card that we're talking about. So we look at Steven Santoli's list. We see the side deck, and we see like a typical side deck outside of like the Gagaga, I guess. Um, like you see these cards pretty much on like a lot of decks. Um, let's take Logan Johnson. Um, Almost literally the exact same side deck. Like he played Bestials instead, and instead of the Gagaga, he played Reinforce. Besides that, like the rest of the side deck looked pretty much the same. We look at this purely list. We see that Nib and Droll are in the main deck instead of like in the side deck like these two people did. We also see Shifter in here. We also see Summon Limit. I'll get to that one in a moment. We see Dark Ruler No More. I already spoke about Dark Ruler No More in the last video, and how this card is probably going to be like a staple like for decks similar like purely moving forward. Um, let's talk about Thrift's list, and let's talk about his main and side deck. We already know he took the board breaker approach. Um, and we know that he wasn't maining the reframing. He was like actually citing it when he knows he's going first. The card I want to talk about is the card next to reframing. That card is Dimensional Barrier. So I guess before we keep covering Dimensional Barrier, let's look at like other lists besides Thrift, because for all we know, other lists could actually be incorporating this. We see Jamel Camacho's Exo-Sister list. They don't have it. We see Hani's list, and Hani played the same deck. They don't play it either. We see Jose Santiago, top 16. They also don't play it. We see Tier Elements, top 16 as well. Josh Kipp. They also don't play it. Kalen Horus Bestial deck. They also don't play it. But yeah, like if we keep going like to these lists, you will notice that not many people are on that card. Here's another one. I guess that's two decks now out of like the top 16. Chris LeBlanc, he also didn't play it. He played Summon Limited instead. This card seems like a staple in purely. We see Labyrinth. Labyrinth does play Dimensional Barrier, but I feel like Dimensional Barrier is pretty much just the mainstay in the Labyrinth deck. Like if you're playing Labyrinth, you're going to play this card, like at least one copy of it. But yeah, like if we keep going, like not many people are on that card. Like this is a dedicated stun deck, by Agent's Persuasion, and he also doesn't play it. Like he opted for Super Agent Organism and Soldier instead. In our tournament list, purely. But yeah, like here's Trevor Gay's Sprite. He did play it. But you know, if we go to the other lists, like the grand majority, they are not on that card. So a few things that we need to talk about when it comes to that. So the first thing we need to talk about is this card still good? Like, is this card still playable in the format? We already saw that Vanadium, Purely, and Tearlaments are all did phenomenal in this past YCS. And, you know, all those three decks actually do fold to this card. Maybe Purely more than the other two. But, yeah, like, this card is not bad against Vanadium. It's not bad against Purely. It's not bad against Tier. If you end up facing against Branded, granted, Branded did not top this YCS, but, you know, that is a deck that also loses to this card. Infernoble Knights, another deck that loses to this card. The Rika Sun Avalon deck is a Link-centric deck, but they do play XYCs. So this card could also be technically useful against them. So, yeah. The main issue with Dimensional Barrier, it's not like the dedicated matchups. I feel like there are other things that factor into this card. The number one factor is SP Little Knight. Like every deck that is going to do remotely well this format is going to be on this card. And this is a card that Dimensional Barrier does not stop. Like if you're facing a link-centric strategy, like the Dimensional Barrier is just going to eat dust, and the people that play SP are just going to like start running over your back row, start running over like your interruptions, and Dimensional Barrier does not stop that. So that's one thing to take note of. Another thing to take note of when it comes to Dimensional Barrier is like despite the good matchups that I brought up, there are other matchups where this card is not that good, and the main contender is Rescue Ace. Like as we see here, Steven Santoli only played 2 XYCs. One of them is utility for breaking boards, and the other one is part of the Cybers package. And we're not even gonna talk about the fusion because there's no way to fuse with it. We see Logan Johnson's list. We see 2 synchros, which granted that could play a factor, but like outside of that and the 4 fusions, which you can't even respond to anyway because of Super Poly, and I guess the Abyss Dweller can be considered. Like there's nothing else in this extra deck that really hurts them when you do Dimensional Barrier. We don't have to talk about Purely. We don't have to talk about Vanadium. Exo Sister is a deck that also loses to Barrier. But yeah, like if Rescue Ace is going to be like the top dog of the metagame, this deck does not lose to Dimensional Barrier at all. So that's one important factor. We also have Unchained as a deck that is very popular in the format, and that's also a deck that doesn't lose to Dimensional Barrier either. Like yes, you can stop the High King Wave Caesar from hitting the board, but like if you're going first, like you don't care about them summoning the High King Caesar on you unless they fully break your board and they try to be on the clapback, and if that situation happens, you're already in a losing position. So it's not that good against Unchained. It's not that good. It's not that good against Rescue Ace. Um, like there are other less popular matchup like Vanquish Soul that is running around. That's also not that good against that. So yeah, like in this upcoming format moving forward, Dimensional Barrier is in a really weird spot because despite the big amount of like the sheer amount of decks this card could be effective against, uh, we are in a very wide format. We're in a format where like at least 10 different decks are going to be doing well in this established metagame, and in a format like this one, you want as many cards that can cover the most ground. And if you know that some of the more meta matchups are not effective against this card, you probably want a card that overlaps for the more popular matchups as well as the non-popular matchups. Like if you're going to like an event with at least 6 rounds of Swiss and then like Top Cut, there are not high odds that you're always going to be facing purely Exosister, Vanadium, and Tear Lament. You are probably might end up on a spot where you just face Rescue Ace, Unchained, Vanquish Soul, Ricas on Avalon, like Dragon Link, like it's stuff like that. And yeah, like moving forward, like I'd say Dimensional Barrier might find a format again, but for the time being, this card is losing a lot of steam. And people, have been asking me in the past few days, is this card still good against certain matchups? Like they asked me like if it's good against Tear Lament. They asked me if it's good against like Vanadium, despite them still being able to play through it with the ability to link climb. Is it good against like Infernoble Knights, because even though it's a synchro centric deck, that deck can still link summon. Uh, but yeah, um, yeah, I'd say this card is in a very tough spot. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on it. I feel like until Valiant Smashers, I think this card might fade out of the format for a little bit. We might get a format where the top dogs are no longer like link centric, and this card might see play again. But yeah, I'd say don't be outside of your toes with this card. If you're playing a deck that loses to specific matchups that this card just really beats them, like for example Branded Chimera, Tear Lament, and like stuff like Purely, you should still really consider this card. However, just take into consideration that you're not always gonna face those matchups, and that is something very obvious when it comes to this format. But I think it's very important to bring it up because, like, 2 formats ago, people were clamoring to have this card like on the forbidden list, and now we're in a format where this card is not really that playable. But that is to say the same thing out of other like contending cards. Like, let's take these 5 floodgates for example. Like, not every floodgate is going to be good every format. Like, Rivalry was not that good last format, and now on this current format that we're in, this card is a little bit more effective, and that took a while for it to happen. Skill Drain is oddly a 3 here in the TCG. Like in the OCG and Master Duel, it's both on both platforms or both formats. This card is limited, so it just going to be a sooner or later a format where this card is further developed. We don't need to talk about TCG. We already knew how good TCG was last format. I feel now, like with Rescue and like other hybrid decks, like Tear Lament and Vanquish Soul, like being existent in the format, this card will be fading out a little bit. But I feel like if you're going to be facing stuff like Purely, stuff like Unchained, stuff like Dragons, like this card will see play, like somewhat, if your deck doesn't lose to it. Like, yeah, I just wanted to talk about Dimensional Barrier because I had a couple of people bring it up, and it is kind of interesting when you just see that literally like 10% of Top Cut was playing that card. But yeah, that's it from me. I hope you found this informative. I hope you found this to your understanding or curiosity. More videos coming soon. Keep practicing and keep doing.